Thank you so much, Ellen, and thanks for having me. I want to thank also Rebecca Pace, whose idea this debate was, I believe, as far as I know. Reverend Finley, thank you, and Reverend Craig, great to be here with you. And as Reverend Dr. Finley said, happy Juneteenth to everybody. I'm here today largely because, well, a number of things, but one thing in particular that compelled me to make this case. Some years ago, I was teaching cello, as I do, in Garfield Park, which, for those not familiar with Chicago, is a economically poor black neighborhood on the west side. It's been redlined. It's been systemically disinvested in, and it faces the consequences of historic systemic racism and ongoing systemic racism every day. And my young student's mom and I were chatting after her lesson, and she told me about how they were driving a loaner vehicle because their van, which was parked at the side of the road, while they were sitting in it, she was sitting in it with her two young kids, it was hit by a drunk driver. It was very badly damaged. Thankfully, all of them were okay, but the van was, I don't know if it was totaled, it was very, very badly damaged. It was no longer drivable. And she told me about how a white police officer came to the scene and saw this white drunk driver and saw them, this black family, and he decided to let this drunk driver go. There was no breathalyzer, there was no blood alcohol test, he was just let free. And what I remember most was not even that description of what happened, it was the way in which she related it to me. She was even casual about how she told me about it. Her exact words were, "Don't let it ruin your weekend." She expected nothing different. This was simply her expectation of the way things were. And at that moment, I realized that this family was not physically safe in this country because of their blackness. And that if I wanted them to be safe, then other millions of other black people, indigenous people, people of color in this country, that I and all of us are compelled to act and speak out and change those conditions. I remember another incident about a year ago after the Black Lives Matter protests, when a young student who was usually so outgoing and chipper and smiling was suddenly withdrawn, and I asked him if he wanted to talk about it, and he didn't say anything at first, and he said, "No, it's okay." And I realized as he started talking to me, he had seen George Floyd being murdered, and he realized that that could be him or one of his family members or one of his loved ones. It could be any of our black family members, indigenous family members, friends, people of color. This is a reality of life in this country, is that people of color are not physically safe in their own bodies because of who they are. And because of our Unitarian Universalist beliefs, we are compelled to do something about that. I wish I could say that these were isolated incidents, but if you look at almost any of the very extensive research on racial injustice and racial imbalances in this country, you see that there are systemic problems in our criminal justice system, as well as employment and housing and you name it, education. These are not isolated experiences, unfortunately. So the reason we need this eighth principle is that we need people of color to be physically safe in this country. We all need to come together and work to crush a culture that says that white lives matter more. I bet that many of you are thinking we as Unitarian Universalists already have principles that dedicate us to fighting against that, because we say all people have inherent worth and dignity. And that is true in theory. Unfortunately, in this country, historically, it's simply a fact that when we've talked about all men, we have implicitly meant all white men. And when we talk about equal protection under the law, we mean equal protection for white people under the law. And I wish that weren't true. It crushes me that that's true, but it's simply where we're at. And that's the reason that we need to make explicit a commitment to anti-racism, that all people truly means all people, regardless of race. I also wish I could say that that implicit assumption was true in the larger society, but not true in Unitarian Universalist circles. But unfortunately, I can't say that either. One of my earliest memories growing up in the Unitarian Universalist Church of Palatine was one of the parents of one of my friends who was a longtime member there. We were just chatting, casually making fun of Ebonics. More recently, I remember at the Unitarian Universalist summer camp where I go to, which draws especially engaged UU youth, that these white youth were telling jokes using the N-word, and they didn't even see anything wrong with that. They didn't understand why that was a problem. This was very recently. At my own church, I, for a long time, noticed that when Black visitors or other visitors of color come, they're not greeted the same way that white visitors are greeted. In fact, when Black members of my church made suggestions for the church to the board, it was 8 months before the board even brought up those suggestions for discussion. In fact, I remember being on the board at the time and asking every month, can we talk about these suggestions from the Black members of our church? Can we talk about these suggestions from the Black members of our church? Can we talk about the suggestions from the Black members of our church? Can we talk about the suggestions from the Black members of our church? Can we talk about the suggestions from the Black members of our church? Can we talk about the suggestions from the Black members of our church? Can we talk about the suggestions from the Black members of our church? Can we talk about the suggestions from the Black members of the church? And the 8th time I said, you know, we have a problem here. If these suggestions had been brought up by white members of the church, there's no way in my mind that they would be not even brought up for discussion for 8 months. It would be tempting to say that these problems, while maybe real, are not as consequential as my student in Garfield Park and so many others like her not being physically safe in her own body. And in some ways, maybe that's true. However, the problem is that this attitude that says that it's okay to have a worship service where pretty much all the readings come from white men and all the materials come from white men, and that's okay, that is part of the same culture that says that it's okay that this Black student is treated this way by the police. It's branches from the same tree with the same root in that culture that says that white lives matter more. Speaking of double standards, I want to be clear about something that I think trips up a lot of opponents of the 8th principle. There's a lot of talk about what accountability would mean. And it's funny to me because this is a concept that actually we already readily accept when it's almost any other group who we're being accountable to. If people who use wheelchairs say, you know, this church is not accessible to me in a wheelchair, and so we put up a ramp to make an accessible entrance, and they say, you know, it's still, this ramp doesn't work, it's too steep, we can't get up. Nobody would argue it would be appropriate to say, no, you're wrong, the ramp is fine. If we put together, if non-parents put together a childcare program for church events for parents, and parents said, you know, this childcare program doesn't serve our needs as parents, this is not meeting our needs for childcare, nobody would say it would be okay.
1 minute.
Nobody would say it would be okay to say, you're wrong, parents, this program is fine. So when we design anti-racism programming and activities, we need to make sure that the people who it serves, the people who are directly affected by racism, say, yes, this is meeting our needs. Obviously, people of color are not a monolith and there will be differences of opinions. There are different ways that we can do that, but we need to make sure that broadly this is meeting the needs of Unitarian Universalists of color. We can unite across racial lines to do this work. Any of us, no matter who we are, can come together, and I think it's appropriate here, speaking with a group that has multiracial in its name, we can work together to crush this culture that says that the lives of people of color, Black people, Indigenous people matter less. We can work together to crush that culture. And in fact, our faith compels us to do that. I want to wish again everybody a happy Juneteenth. I also have to say, I don't think this is the appropriate day to be having this debate. And again, I think if it were not Black people who had brought up this resolution to fight.
Your time is up. Your time is up. You've run over your 15 minutes.
We started at 11 after, right? Or 12 after?
12 after, and I have about 23 after.
So that's been about 12?
Okay. I'm short. I'm in there.
Okay.
You're right.
Thank you, Alan. No worries. I don't think this is the appropriate day to do this. And in fact, if it were another group, if the identity of the group in question were different, I think it would be easy to see why it's inappropriate. If Jewish Unitarian Universalists called on us to resolve to dismantle anti-Semitism, it would be inappropriate, I think, to argue against that resolution on Holocaust Remembrance Day. So this is, I believe, the wrong day to be having this debate. In conclusion, if we want people like my Black student, our friends and loved ones of color, to be physically safe in this country, we need to be active in committing to dismantling racism and other forms of oppression. In fact, all we need to do to perpetuate the conditions that make Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color unsafe in this country, all we need to do is nothing. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "He who accepts evil without protesting against it is really cooperating with it." So we are called by our faith. We really have no choice to be impelled by our faith to adopt the eighth principle. Thank you very much.